Solving the human trafficking epidemic, which is what it is a priority for my administration. We're going to help out a lot.
An older man seen on that surveillance video. Now, thankfully, the boy's mother was able to yank her son out of the would-be kidnapper's car. Watch as this man gets out of this car, runs over and grabs this 5-year-old boy off Hillside Avenue around 8 o'clock Thursday night. His mother and siblings frantically follow.
4:30 a.m. Minneapolis was already unraveling after Ilhan Omar's call framed unrest as resistance. Behind the chaos, a mayor once praised for compassion was quietly betraying the city's trust.
We are going to make sure that these people pay for what they have done to us.
Ilhan Omar, she shouldn't be allowed to be a congresswoman, and I'm sure people are looking at that, and she should be thrown the hell out of our country.
More than 200 children vanished without records inside privately operated migrant hotels. Hundreds of pediatric corneas were quietly routed through 5 international destinations. Over 3 tons of lethal narcotics moved through the same channels across the United States. Do you want to uncover what was meant to stay hidden? Tap like, subscribe to the channel, and stay with this investigation as everything is exposed. 10 days into the new year, Minneapolis still appeared functional on the surface. Public transit ran on reduced schedules. Grocery stores remained open under heightened security. Snow-covered streets softened the visual signs of strain. But internally, the city was already operating under pressure metrics normally associated with declared emergencies. The rupture followed a single shooting that left a local woman dead. Within 6 hours, the incident had generated more than 14 million online interactions across regional platforms. Hashtags tied to the event outpaced official police updates by nearly 5-1. Before investigators completed their initial evidence review, public conclusions had already hardened. When Ilhan Omar addressed the situation, her remarks emphasized permanence, belonging, and collective resolve. Supporters interpreted the message as reassurance during uncertainty. Inside law enforcement coordination centers, however, analysts flagged the timing and tone as destabilizing. In a city already tracking elevated risk indicators, the statement was assessed as a legitimizing force for escalation rather than de-escalation. Over the next 72 hours, protest registrations expanded from isolated downtown zones into residential districts. Emergency call volume increased by 41%, while response capacity dropped as units were reassigned to crowd control. Intelligence monitoring recorded a 260% rise in encrypted messaging traffic, referencing organized presence rather than spontaneous assembly. No fires yet, no barricades. But the conditions had shifted. Minneapolis was no longer managing a single incident. It was entering a phase where narrative, perception, and momentum began to move faster than containment. The city had not collapsed into disorder, but its balance no longer depended on stability. It depended on which force accelerated first. By the 3rd day, the response shifted from local containment to federal scale. Convoys of armored vehicles rolled into Minneapolis before dawn. More than 9,000 federal agents and border personnel were positioned across transit corridors, government buildings, and key intersections. Aerial patrol hours doubled. Temporary checkpoints appeared overnight, then multiplied again by sunset. On paper, the number suggested control. Coverage density reached levels normally reserved for major national security events. Command dashboards showed overlapping jurisdictions, redundant patrol routes, and continuous surveillance loops. But the streets told a different story. Instead of dispersing, unrest fractured. Demonstrations no longer formed around central plazas. They split into smaller, faster-moving groups across residential blocks. Police logs recorded over 380 coordinated disruptions in a single weekend. Arson attempts, rolling roadblocks, targeted infrastructure interference. Emergency dispatch volume surged by more than 55%, while average response times stretched beyond acceptable thresholds. Night after night, officers were forced into reactive posture. Tear gas deployments increased. Flash detonations echoed through neighborhoods not listed on protest permits. Fires ignited, were extinguished, then reignited elsewhere. The city was no longer facing a crowd, it was facing saturation. Here's the question to consider. When a system commits nearly everything it has and still loses control, what does that distraction leave unguarded? Because as attention locked onto streets and sirens, something quieter began forming beneath the noise. Patterns that did not match chaos. And those patterns would pull investigators away from crowds and toward places no one was watching closely enough. While Minneapolis burned in plain sight, another crisis was forming in silence. Inside federal systems, a pattern began to surface, slowly at first, then with disturbing clarity. Missing person reports involving minors were no longer scattered. They were converging, ages narrowed, timelines compressed, locations repeated with statistical precision. What initially appeared as administrative backlog crossed a threshold and triggered escalation. In just 6 days, more than 210 reports involving children remained unresolved. Analysts noticed that over 80% clustered around the same category of properties. Privately owned hotels contracted as temporary housing, buildings shielded from inspection under emergency exemptions, buildings no one was entering while the city focused outward. Utility data told a different story. Electricity usage spiked after midnight. Water consumption surged in short, synchronized intervals. Medical supply deliveries, saline, sedatives, disposable equipment were logged under generic vendors and routed through secondary contractors. None of it aligned with shelter operations. At 04:27 a.m., sealed federal warrants cleared final review. 3 minutes later, unmarked vehicles moved. The target sat just off a major transit corridor. No sirens, no lights. Surveillance feeds confirmed armed guards positioned inside stairwells. Intelligence flagged automatic weapons and reinforced interior doors. The risk assessment was blunt. Delay was not an option. The breach unfolded in seconds. Resistance attempted to slow entry but collapsed under coordinated advance. Upper floors were secured rapidly. Then teams reached rooms that had been intentionally isolated, sealed, dark, locked from within. What waited behind those doors stopped the operation cold. Rows of beds, curtains drawn, medical waste discarded hastily. Children lay motionless, many sedated to suppress panic. Wrists marked with numbers, not names, inventory, not identity. Medical teams were called in immediately as oxygen levels were restored and heart rates stabilized. The final count locked at 200 children, ages 8 to 17, all alive but several hovering near failure thresholds. Investigators later confirmed that a delay of even a few hours would have changed the outcome permanently. Recovered documents revealed outbound schedules already in motion. Port windows measured in hours, containers prepared, routes approved. What weeks of unrest had concealed was now exposed. This was not neglect, it was coordination, and the clock was still running. With the children secured, the investigation pivoted away from the hotel rooms and toward ownership. Federal teams stopped asking who had been inside the buildings and began asking who controlled them. Property records revealed a pattern hidden beneath layers of shell companies. 12 hotels used for migrant and refugee housing traced back to 3 management firms. Those firms, in turn, shared legal counsel, accounting services, and overlapping board members. The structure was not accidental. It was designed to fragment accountability. At the center of that web stood Sophia Abdi Aden. Publicly, she was celebrated as a humanitarian leader. Over 5 years, her administration had directed more than $120 million into emergency housing, food programs, and medical outreach. Press coverage framed her as a stabilizing force during repeated crises. Oversight waivers were granted under her authority during periods of unrest, allowing facilities to bypass routine inspections for safety reasons. Internally, analysts saw something else. Financial disclosures showed that companies tied to her inner circle quietly acquired controlling stakes in multiple housing properties. Maintenance contracts were inflated by as much as 280%. Security services were outsourced to private firms operating without municipal review. Inspection delays averaged 14 months, far beyond emergency allowances. Children moved through the system without consistent tracking. Intake forms were incomplete, budgets were altered. Health screenings followed identical templates regardless of background. Medical logs later revealed minimum weight thresholds in standardized clearance notes, criteria that had nothing to do with shelter placement. By conservative estimates, at least 230 minors passed through these facilities over an 18-month period. More than 200 disappeared from documentation entirely. This was not negligence layered on chaos. It was governance turned inward. Authority had not failed. It had been repurposed. As warrants expanded and bank records were subpoenaed, the picture sharpened. The unrest outside had not disrupted operations. It had protected them. While the city burned under cameras and sirens, the machinery behind closed doors continued without interruption. And for the first time, investigators understood the scale of what they were confronting. This was not a scandal, it was an infrastructure. Once the ownership structure was exposed, investigators followed the next logical step. Not where the children had been held, but where they were scheduled to disappear. The trail led away from Minneapolis streets and toward the ports. Digital records recovered during the hotel raid revealed outbound logistics already in motion. Within a 72-hour window, 13 shipping containers were registered for departure under legitimate export companies. Their declared contents were unremarkable: clothing pallets, packaged food, household goods, cargo that passed through U.S. ports by the tens of thousands each week. Nothing on the manifest suggested urgency or risk. That was the camouflage. Hidden schematics told a different story. Inside the containers, false interior walls and reinforced flooring created concealed compartments engineered with precision. Ventilation channels were minimal but sufficient. Space was restricted but deliberate. Each unit was designed to transport between 16 and 20 sedated occupants, immobilized to prevent movement, noise, or detection. Thermal dampening materials were layered to defeat routine scans. The goal was not comfort, it was survival, just long enough to reach open water. Financial data aligned with the shipping schedules almost perfectly. Banking records showed coordinated payments landing days before each departure. Six-figure transfers were split into smaller increments, routed through offshore intermediaries, and delivered to port facilitators, customs brokers, and private logistics managers. Over a single 12-month period, more than $1.1 billion moved through these channels without triggering automatic reviews. Every transaction stayed just below reporting thresholds. Every account appeared clean in isolation. The same corridors appeared again in narcotics intelligence. Customs and border analysis confirmed that identical routes had moved over 3.4 tons of heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl annually into North America. Different cargo, identical infrastructure. Containers traveled out with children concealed inside. They returned with drugs distributed inland through established networks. Human trafficking and narcotics trafficking were not separate enterprises. They were synchronized streams feeding the same system. What made the operation nearly invisible was its reliance on normality. No rushed shipments, no irregular hours. Containers moved on schedule, cleared by paperwork that had been approved weeks in advance. Corruption did not disrupt port operations. It blended into them. By the time emergency holds were issued on the identified containers, the margin had narrowed to hours. Federal briefings later confirmed that once those shipments reached international waters, recovery probabilities would have dropped below 5%. At that point, the trail would have gone cold, buried under jurisdictional barriers and sealed steel. The children had been stopped at the threshold, but the machinery that nearly carried them away was far larger than any single raid. It was a system built for repetition, not speed. And as investigators secured the ports, they understood the truth with chilling clarity. Stopping the containers had saved lives. Stopping the system would require following something even harder to catch: the money. The decisive breakthrough did not come from another raid. It came from spreadsheets. With the ports frozen and the physical routes exposed, federal teams shifted into a quieter phase of the operation. Financial analysts, forensic accountants, and Treasury investigators began tracing flows that had moved unnoticed for years. Not cash seized in safes, but money that never looked suspicious enough to stop. Over a 6-year span, more than $2.6 billion passed through a dense web of humanitarian nonprofits, migrant housing grants, emergency medical programs, and subcontracted service providers linked to the same inner circle. On paper, every entity complied. Audits were filed, budgets balanced. Oversight committees approved renewals without objection. The laundering was not crude, it was engineered. Funds were deliberately fragmented into predictable amounts, dispersed across fiscal quarters to avoid spikes. Medical supply contracts were inflated by 250 to 340%. generating surplus capital that quietly exited the country through consulting fees and international service payments. 49 shell organizations across 5 regions recycled the same money under different purposes. Food aid one quarter, housing stabilization the next, emergency outreach after that. Each label diluted scrutiny. The pattern only became visible when investigators stopped looking at individual accounts and began examining timing. 6-figure transfers appeared repeatedly just days before container departures, always below automatic reporting thresholds, always routed through intermediaries who appeared unrelated on paper, yet shared identical transaction fingerprints. The same accounts that paid port facilitators also received deposits tied to narcotics distribution inland. Different crimes, identical pipelines. As the financial map sharpened, protection began to erode. Court continuances granted during periods of unrest were re-examined. Inspection delays once justified by public safety concerns were pulled apart line by line. Internal communications recovered from encrypted backups revealed coordinated language across agencies, requests to postpone, defer, or quietly reclassify reports until conditions stabilized. Stabilization never came. The delay was the strategy. Within days, subpoenas moved quietly across municipal offices, housing authorities, nonprofit boards, and port intermediaries. No sirens, no headlines, just paper, emails, call logs, banking authorizations, evidence that did not shout but could not be denied. Resignations followed in silence. Senior oversight officials stepped aside citing health and family reasons. Legal consultants severed contracts overnight. Protection withdrew without explanation, leaving gaps where certainty had once stood. By the time indictments were drafted, the scale was undeniable. This was not a network hiding from the system. It was a system hiding behind itself. Investigators concluded that the operation had survived not because enforcement was absent, but because legitimacy had been weaponized. Procedures followed. Forms approved, boxes checked. Children disappeared between line items no one thought to question. When the financial shield finally collapsed, the illusion collapsed with it. What remained was exposure and the understanding that the most effective cover is not chaos, it is compliance. When the final warrants were executed and the last financial records were sealed, Minneapolis did not celebrate. There were no public announcements marking a victory, no moment where the city could exhale and pretend the danger had passed. 200 children were recovered alive, but the margin between rescue and disappearance had been measured in hours, not days. What this investigation revealed was not simply a criminal operation. It exposed a structural weakness, a system that did not collapse under pressure, but adapted to it. A network that did not rely on secrecy or brute force, but on legitimacy, on permits, grants, inspections deferred for safety, and procedures followed so precisely that no one felt the need to look closer. While streets filled with noise and attention fixed on confrontation, the real machinery moved quietly. Containers were scheduled, payments cleared, paperwork flowed. The most dangerous moment was not when the city burned, but when everything appeared normal. The children were saved because this time someone followed the trail past the chaos, past the headlines, past the excuses. They followed it through property records, shipping manifests, and financial ledgers that never scream when something is wrong. And that is the lesson that remains. Crimes like this do not disappear when one network falls. They relocate, they wait, they look for the next moment when oversight relaxes and attention drifts elsewhere. Systems only protect the vulnerable when they are questioned. Power only answers when it is observed. If this story made you stop, stay engaged. If you believe silence should never be more comfortable than truth, leave a comment and share your thoughts. And if you want to follow investigations that look beyond the noise and into the structures beneath it, subscribe to the channel, because the cost of looking away has already been counted. And next time, the margin may not be measured in hours,